computer. Okay, go ahead.
Great. So can you see me all right? Everybody can see and hear me all right
Mhm.
correctly?
Yes. A
Perfect.
little bit of
Okay.
your forehead is cut off, but
Ah, okay. Well, maybe I should go. Is that
That's
better?
good.
good.
That's
Yes.
good.
Is that better?
Yep.
Hmm.
I'm going to put you on speaker view. Okay.
Great. All right. So I have to tell you, I'm really looking forward to sharing my ideas here. I have found this book to be just utterly fascinating. And my purpose in being able to share my thoughts about it tonight are really related to that joy and that enthusiasm I have about it. And so I just hope that you would find it equally exciting. If you don't, that's all right. For the things that I'll use as disclaimers here for you. But I just do hope that we have an opportunity to listen to what I have to say, and certainly to be people that if it's uncomfortable that you say that it's uncomfortable for you, and we could talk about it. I would share with you that this is a very long book. It's almost 500 pages. I hope to take about 15 minutes of your time. However, I'm Irish, and so I can tell a 5-minute story in 5 minutes, or I can tell a 5-minute story in an hour. It's just my nature. So I'm going to ask Emery just to keep me on clock in terms of where
Okay.
I am, because again I can go off on tangents faster than a cat chasing a mouse. So that I would share with you that um, I think that you will hopefully be tweaked or perked to know more, because this is not the normal biography of whatever normal is, of biography of Saint Ignatius. So whatever you've read in the past, this book will be very, very different. Some of the things I may talk about with you are not meant to be uncomfortable for you, but they might be based upon your own backgrounds or the way that you look at this. So I just want to prepare you for that from the very beginning. If you like this book, Father Meissner, who is actually was a professor of psychoanalysis at Boston College. He wrote another book about the psychological study of the spiritual exercises. I have not read that book. I'm looking forward to reading it. That's about 600 pages. So I think you said, Emery, that we're going to be looking at the spiritual exercises in September, or
Yes. Yeah, we're hoping to do them.
right. So I hope that I can tackle that book um, before that time. Also, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the first time in terms of our evolution as a group that we've begun like a book review kind of situation.
Yep.
And so I would just share with you that I would very much appreciate your comments about whether my style was helpful to you, was not, because I would like to be able to talk about it next time in terms of looking at Ignatian mysticism from the perspective of what Father Meissner talks about, the psychoanalytical approach. And so that if you have some suggestions or criticism, certainly, um, I would hope that you'd feel comfortable enough to sharing them with me. I love criticism. I love suggestions. So it doesn't bother me at all. And so I hope that you would bring those forward for me as well. Okay. So very basically then, I want to just talk about, remember, I'm an educator, so I got to do it my way. So I'm going to talk about the goals that we're going to accomplish tonight. So the goals are going to be that we're going to talk about psychoanalysis. What is that? Remember, that's Father Meissner's perspective. That's the lens he's using here in regard to how he's looking at Ignatius. And that's very, very important. I would also ask you to begin to think about yourselves in terms of how you think. So, Judy, I think I mentioned this last time with you, but it's not meant as a dig, certainly. But Judy, as a math person, sees the world very differently than most of us who aren't math people, because she sees it in a very linear fashion. That is, that A needs to equal B, and then B goes to C, and C goes to D. Now, you can add A and B to get to C and D, but I'm not that kind of a thinker. And with psychoanalysis, in terms of what Father Meissner is talking about, he's not looking at it that way either. So I'm more of what we call a concept mapper. So I will present different ideas to you, and you're going to be looking for closure for those ideas, but they're sort of going to be hanging out there for you.
Okay.
So I'm going to put a lot of things out there, and the linear people are going to say, like, how does that connect with that? So what I'm just saying to you is let yourself go. Just be pretend you're in the water, and you're floating, because I'm going to throw these different things out there for you. I will hopefully tie those in terms of when I do my close, again, educator, when I do my closure, to wrap those things together for you. But so I just ask you to prepare for that as we talk. Also, being an educator, that when we present something, we talk about topics such as Bloom's taxonomy. So I'm afraid I'm giving you a lot of topics here and a lot of terms. I don't mean to be a wonk to you about that, but I'm just trying to encourage you to come to this book in the way that Father Meissner is coming to it. In other words, when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, there are the lower levels of Bloom, which would be talking about knowledge and comprehension. So a lot of times when we're looking at something, reading a book or a newspaper article or even a conversation, people are looking for the low-hanging fruit. What do I remember about this? Oh, I can make that connection. But Bloom would talk about then the mid-level, which would be analysis and application. In other words, how do I analyze what's being said to me? And more importantly, when we get to the higher levels, we're talking about synthesis and evaluation. So when Father Meissner writes, he's really talking about giving us some basic information, but he's going to go right into that analysis and then jumping right into the synthesis and evaluation in terms of what he's saying about Ignatius as a person. So in other words, when he presents this, he's not talking about Ignatius as being a canonized saint. All right. He's talking about Ignatius as being a man, and the forces he had all the way from childhood, all the way up to eventually being this saint. And what I hope to do tonight is to be able to present a little of that to you. So I would share with you that this is not the kind of book you want to read unless you want to fall asleep. So this is not a light read. It's intense, it's heavy, and it requires a lot of thinking. And so my goal here tonight is to try to simplify that for you. Okay. I would encourage you, again, being the teacher, I would encourage you to take some notes, because I'm going to present some terms here for you, and you may not really like those terms, or may just have a difference of misunderstanding about them. So at this particular point, I'm just going to put out for finally that disclaimer. Anything I say tonight, I don't mean to offend you. And if something I say offends you, please tell me. But I'm going to get into some heavy topics that if you don't deal with this all the time, you may not find it maybe comfortable for you. All right, so let's just start off with the fact that, again, Father Meissner is talking about Ignatius, and so in terms of psychoanalysis. So if you have some visual images of psychoanalysis with Sigmund Freud, you might think of a psychiatrist on a couch, rather on a chair, and the client is on the couch. So basically, he's put Ignatius on a couch, and he's basically asking Ignatius to talk, even though Ignatius can't. So he's talking for Ignatius, and he's analyzing his thoughts. All right. So if I may, to give you a little further understanding of this, so this is called the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. All right. So the first two volumes, 1 and 2, were basically written by Freudian psychiatrists, because we're talking about mental disorders. Now, that may be an uncomfortable topic for you. So I don't wish to offend you. I can share with you, I use it all the time. And in case you're suffering from any kind of sense of pride, we're all in here. In some way, shape, or form. We're not specifically diagnosed maybe with one particular thing, but as I go through this, if I were to go through this and talk about these different things, there are what we call diagnostic criteria. We're all in here in some way, shape, or form. It's not to the extent of a mental disorder, but it is something that Father Meissner will talk about in terms of when he's talking about Ignatius, he's talking about him as a broken human being, which we all are. And so I would ask you to begin also to think about, and I'll hopefully make this connection at the end of this. I found by reading this book, I understood Pope Francis much more clearly. Because I think, I don't know if the Holy Father ever read this book, um, but I would share with you that when you examine Ignatius from this perspective, you see how the Holy Father, whom I think I said this last time, to me is the spiritual director of the world. And he's really taking it, in my opinion, he's really taking the spiritual exercises to the whole world without calling them as such. And he's really leading us on retreat, I think, through all his different teachings about what he knows, and what he knows about who God is in terms of his tremendous mercy. And what I think, for me, what Francis talks about so eloquently is the humanness of all of us. And Father Meissner certainly talks about this. So if you have this exalted view of Ignatius or saints, you'll be terribly disappointed when you read this, because Father Meissner doesn't refer to Ignatius in that way in the beginning and as he evolves, but he shows how Ignatius evolves as a human, how he evolves in terms of his thoughts. And basically, I think this goes back now. So take that idea, hold it. Let's go back to Bloom now in terms of knowledge, comprehension, application, synthesis, and evaluation. I think one of the things, if he were here tonight, obviously he would say, that's enough, Tim. You can sit down now. I'll take over now in terms of presenting my book. But I mean, it's going to be, I think what he's talking about here is how do we synthesize and evaluate our own lives in terms of our own actions? So it's almost like a psychological examen, if you will, in terms of, in the book form of Ignatius. And I think what he's really saying to us is, how do we take these issues that Ignatius deals with, and how do we deal with them in our own personal lives? All right. So basically, psychoanalysis is the fact that Freud believed that the source of our feelings are hidden from us. And that by going to psychoanalysis and by talking about these things come out. Obviously, we can't do that with Ignatius. So what Father Meissner talks about here is he's looking at Ignatius in terms of his culture. So if you've studied psychology, there's a Russian psychologist called Lev Vygotsky who does a lot here in terms of culture, context, race. And so basically, Father Meissner is talking about how, if you will, Ignatius is a product of 15th century Spain. So before I go into that next part, there's an instructional technique we use, which is called the 10-2 rule. So basically, and Judy does this all the time in terms of teaching math, especially because it's so linear and it's so concrete, but you present something and then you pause and then you ask your students, anybody have any questions? Are any connections I need to make here for you as we go through this? Because looking at it from another perspective of what we call, and you've probably heard of him, Jean Piaget, is that Piaget will talk about that every time we read something, we listen to something, whether it be music or anything in a written form, we are constructing meaning based upon our own backgrounds. And so at this particular juncture, before I get into this next part, I just want to ask if anybody has any questions at this particular point. Anything that I haven't clarified for you?
No. Just to let you know, Jamie will be joining us soon, but I told him to just jump on and we'll talk after your presentation.
Sure.
Okay.
So we're good?
Yes, good.
Mhm.
Okay. So again, this is not meant to be a quiz session, but I don't know if any of you read the New Yorker magazine. So the New Yorker I find fascinating because of just the quality of the writing. I feel as though that when I can read quality writing, I become a better writer. So one of the writers I really like to read is a fellow from Harvard, a fellow by the name of Louis Menard. And I was not an English major. I wanted to be an English major because I find books fascinating. And I like to talk about characters and so forth. But Louis Menard postulates that we're all reading Jane Austen incorrectly. He contends that Jane Austen is really a satirical writer of English society.
Absolutely,
Now,
she is. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
absolutely.
Okay, so
She's my favorite author, but yeah.
right. So, Judy, that would be a minority opinion among most people who read Austen. Okay, they elaborate on Austen and feel as though that she really was just talking about the wonderful nature of English society. All right, where Menard contends that we've taught Austen incorrectly through the years, and that most readers of Austen would look at it from a very idealized perspective. And the reason I'm bringing that up is I think that's really what Father Meissner is talking about here, is that we need to look at Ignatius from a very human perspective. So you've heard me say that a number of times in terms of intertwining this aspect of Ignatius being a human. And oftentimes I know when I've read biographies, I didn't get that sense that he was human, or any saint was human. They didn't really evolve into it, that they were sort of always gifted from the very beginning. And what I think Father Meissner talks about here, as I'm going to talk about, is the fact that is not the case at all. So basically, he's talking about Ignatius, as I said, from the 15th century Spain perspective. That is, in terms of, if in order to St. Ignatius, we need to understand the culture of the time. And he's talking about how Ignatius is a Basque. Now, you know that the Basques are a very rebellious people. They're in northern Spain. You also know, I think, that Pedro Arrupe was a Basque. Now, just as a side point here, I had an uncle who was a Jesuit. He's now deceased. So I grew up in a family environment where my mother's best friends all had Jesuits as brothers. It was unique. So I grew up hearing about Pedro before I knew he was Pedro Arrupe as being the superior general of the Jesuits, because he was spoken about in a first name basis in our house. And the whole idea of the Basques. Now, I don't know if I've ever shared this with the group, but I'm a first generation American. My father and my grandfather and his brothers were all involved with Sinn Féin. So my two great uncles were executed by the British. They were after my own grandfather, and he emigrated to this country illegally. So, and my grandfather was an illegal immigrant to this country. I think my father was too. Um, and there was great pride because I was an American, and I was not allowed to go back to Ireland when I was, in college, because my father always said to me, there are people there who will kill you. So my father did not serve in the armed forces during the Second World War. Was forbidden to. My father was working for the IRA. And again, I hope that you'll still talk to me. But I grew up, dinner time conversations at our house were, if the IRA had accepted Hitler, Hitler could have invaded Ireland, used that as a springboard to invade England. And the idea being that Hitler was the lesser of two evils, because the Queen and the monarchy, so again, no offense to those who follow the crown, I can't watch it, but that was a greater evil. And the IRA felt as though that if they knocked off the monarchy, then they would knock off Hitler. So we growing up, I heard a lot about the Basques, because the Basques were, some people view them as still as a terrorist organization. My father, according to the English, was a terrorist. So as a young child, I really settled into this whole thing about the Basque culture, because that's what I heard all the time as a child. And basically, the Basque culture, which Father Meissner talks about, is the whole idea, especially a male, is his pride in himself and his independence. So if you just look at those two character traits, you can see how they come through with Ignatius. the whole idea about, for me, he's sitting in the bed after Pamplona, and he reads about the lives of the saints, and he says, when he reads about Francis and Dominic, and he says, I can do that. He just had this tremendous, well, and I'll get into this, but he had a tremendous sense of self-confidence. And that came from, his upbringing, this courtier fashion. We've all heard the stories about, excuse me, when he broke his leg and how he had to have it reset because it wouldn't look, appropriately in terms of the way of his dress was, in terms of what a knight would look like in 15th century Spain. So Father Meissner talks about this whole sense of pride and independence in a very positive way about who Ignatius is. And if you will, again, this is the point about jumping here. He really talks about how God uses this in terms of Ignatius's character development. So, for instance, in terms of how am I doing on time here, Anna Marie? I think I'm rolling here.
Yeah, so it's 7:31. If you want to continue another, how many more? 15 minutes? I think that's fine.
I think I could do it in another 10 just to wrap up this because I don't want to
Okay.
occupy the whole evening here, obviously. But for instance, Father Meissner will, and again, this might be uncomfortable for you. He talks about, as you know, Father Ignatius was born the youngest of 13 children. Ignatius's mother died shortly after his birth. Ignatius was given to a wet nurse and sent out. So Father Meissner will talk about this sense of maternal deprivation, the psychoanalytical approach to what happens with maternal deprivation. What happens to that loss of identity with a mother? How does that impact his role with women? Obviously, if you've read other saints, you might think immediately of Saint Therese in terms of the fact that she didn't lose her mother at birth. She lost her mother at 4 years of age, I believe, approximately. But she was also given to a wet nurse. And so what impact did that have on the life of Saint Therese? Obviously, from a Freudian perspective, Father Meissner will talk about how, and again, this is what I grew up doing this, but to me, there's a very strong connection with the Jesuit approach to education and a Freudian approach, because the Jesuits always talked about how they wanted to get children at a very young age because they wanted to form them. I think that's why the Jesuits got into education so quickly, because of Ignatius's own experience, because Ignatius, I think, evolved into the sense of what maternal deprivation was, and he wanted to instill that sense into children, to young students, what a life could be, because he felt that loss himself as a person. Now, this could be a jump here for you, so I just want to prepare you for it. So Father Meissner will talk about the literal sense of losing the physical connectedness with a mother. Mother dies. But I think he's also asking us to project in terms of the conceptual sense of what a relationship loss really means, and what it means for an adult, and what it means for a child. So basically what happens is that a child, when he loses a parent, will respond very differently than an adult, because normally adults, just talking normally, not saying correctly, I'm just saying normally adults deal with loss by not talking about it too much, where a child will still talk about it. So again, I'm Irish. But from the Irish perspective, when there was a funeral, there was a party. I came from a tradition where people were waked at home. My father referred to the obituaries as the Irish editorials. So I grew up in Spring Lake. So my father commuted to New York every day. So I just have fond memories of him getting off the train, and my mother gave him the upbeat in terms of who died. So and I was an only child. So I have to tell you, I have a childhood experience of we went home for dinner, and we went out to funeral homes. And so much so that I remember as a young child, because I would go in the kitchen and do my homework because it was a celebration. Um, and I remember the funeral director approaching me as a young child and said, "You want to be a funeral director?" But I saw death as being very positive. And just a quick story, if I may digress for a moment. But I remember when my aunt died. As I said, I grew up in Spring Lake, and the pastor of the parish was the auxiliary bishop of the Trenton diocese. And so, going way back, like I had to meet him at the door with a candle when he came into the house. And when he came into the house, I remember this very vividly as a child. Everybody was laughing in the kitchen, and because he was the bishop, I think he felt as though he didn't want to embarrass the people. So I remember him saying to me, "Timothy, go into the kitchen and tell them that I'm here, and tell them we're going to say the rosary." And so I did that, and I came back to him, and he said, "I know exactly when you said it to him because everything stopped." But it was the sense of, it was a celebration. You were happy the person died, in the sense that they had run the race, they had gone home to the Lord. So I think where I'm trying to go with this is that Father Meissner talks about how Ignatius has this idealization of things, again, based upon his experience. He again meant, the maternal deprivation here is that he had to make relationships very positive for himself, because he was dealing with this whole sense of loss. Now, it's what I want to make very clear is this is not a negative experience. What Father Meissner is telling us is that we all do this, but this is what makes him a saint, because he relies upon the grace of God to help him deal with this. So when you read Ignatius's life in a maybe a more vanilla form, his biography, his sense of this illusion he had with, remember, trying to find this woman that was of a royal nature, and but again, with society, he could never really have a chance with that woman because of where he stood in the societal structure. But he had this sense of he could do that because he just knew that, again, the tremendous self-confidence that Ignatius has. And Father Meissner will talk about how this really comes from a psychoanalytical perspective, this maternal deprivation and his way of dealing with that. Now, that may be uncomfortable for you. I don't know. He does call, again, this might be very uncomfortable for you ladies. He does call Ignatius. He says that Ignatius suffers from phallic narcissism. Now, that's not something you open up a conference with, in terms of discussing, St. Ignatius of Loyola. But that's how Father Meissner would see him, as he would see that the women that were attracted to Ignatius really were sexually repressed. Why does Ignatius go out to prostitutes? Why does he go out to women? Because he wanted to have a very positive relationship with women. But, and again, I don't mean to upset you here, but Father Meissner will talk about that Ignatius had to repress his sexuality. Now, that goes into a whole thing about celibacy and so forth. But I think one of the key elements here is that Father Meissner will talk about that, but he'll talk simply about prayer, in terms of Ignatius would pray about these sexual temptations he had, these sexual issues that he had. And he clearly talks about how that Ignatius believed that through prayer to the blessed intercession of the Blessed Mother, that he conquered these things. Now, these are all normal human experiences. I can't speak for women, obviously, but these are things that I talk to my boys about, because this is normal masculinity. in terms of what life is like. But again, this may be very uncomfortable for you, and I don't mean to upset you with this, but this is the depth. I wanted to use this as an example. This is the depth of what Father Meissner talks about in terms of the book. That might appeal to you. It might turn you off. I don't know. But I just want you to know that's his lens. That's the lens that he's using in terms of looking at the life of Ignatius. Now, he would talk about, as Father Meissner would talk about, this sense of psychoanalysis, that if it's not properly dealt with, it deals with psychopathology in adults. Now, he doesn't say that Ignatius suffered from that specifically, but he does talk about the whole sense of what that meant. So, for instance, just jumping back a little bit to Ignatius, Ignatius's father, we believe, had illegitimate children, maybe as many as 3. So when we talk about Ignatius being the youngest of 13, there were some other people there that didn't share the same mother. And these children were basically born out of wedlock. I think that's possibly why he had a sense about prostitutes and about women who were in trouble, because he felt that need. And again, Father Meissner is talking about this is very healthy because he's dealing with the psychosis of it. But again, that may not be the way you think about it in terms of a saint. If I could just, I know I'm tight on time, but there are just a couple of quotes. If I may, Emery, just to read a little bit here, because I think it encapsulates something what I'm talking about here. But if we give credence to the theory of parental loss, particularly maternal deprivation, the psychological sequelae could be expected to play themselves out through the ensuing years. The effect of the early loss of the woman who gave him birth may have also been complicated by Inigo, because he was Inigo at that time, Inigo's subsequent separation from his nurse when he returned to his rightful place in the castle of Loyola. So we have a sense of abandonment here. We have a sense of his own mother and then his nurse bringing him back to his house. How did Ignatius deal with that abandonment? And truly, this is my opinion, personal, so I'm just editorializing or giving my thoughts here, my projection. I think this is really the gift of the spiritual exercises, because my take on the spiritual exercises overpoweringly is the profound love that God has for me. There's no sense of abandonment here at all. That God loves me, that God always loved me, and that God will always love me, regardless of what I do, because he's my father. And I think that, again, without these experiences, we don't have the spiritual exercises because of Ignatius's personal viewpoint. Again, from a psychoanalytical perspective, this is all very healthy. So I don't want it to be misconstrued as I'm talking about this, that this maternal deprivation, this, if I may, phallic narcissism is evil. It's not. It's normal. It's natural. Ignatius worked through that. One other point here. From our vantage point, we can list some possible effects: a pervasive sense of loss and an underlying depression, an unsatisfied yearning for attachment and reunion with the lost mother that would affect his future relationships with women, the idealization and aggrandizement of the repressed image of the lost mother, a powerful identification with the lost mother, a yearning for reunion with the mother in death, and an attachment to and an idealization of the state of death itself. This is how he writes. So if you never pick up the book, I may have just turned you off completely, or may have excited you wholeheartedly, because this is how he writes in the book. And again, that may be of interest to you. It may not be of interest to you. I'm sure you're looking at the time there, so I'll just try to finish up here. I would just try to quickly close again with my own sense here. And again, if I may, Emery, continue next time in terms of Ignatian mysticism, if that'd be all right.
Sure,
if it's
sure.
not, tell me.
Yep.
But I've tried to give you some streams of consciousness here in terms of not just Ignatius's life, but our own lives.
Mhm.
So this requires that synthesis and evaluation, our reflection. Who are we as people? I'm not suggesting you go see a psychoanalyst, but if I may, I think that's the projection of the examen. And again, I think the examen has its roots in Ignatius's childhood. And so what I just suggest that we all do is look at our own childhood and see where we are with that. Now, this is, again, totally me. This is not Father Meissner. I don't know if any of you have a great love for Teilhard de Chardin.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
I do. So I didn't know his last name because, again, in the environment that I grew up in, as you may know, Teilhard was banned.
Mhm. Yeah.
Again, I'm Irish and I have a very rebellious nature. My mother and father used to have study groups about Teilhard in our living room. Okay, so I took French. I took French actually from the 5th grade on. So I just knew Teilhard. I mean, I was too young to comprehend what he was talking about, but Teilhard, obviously, as a paleontologist, has this strong sense of evolutionary theory. And so I don't know if any of you have this book here.
Yeah.
Okay,
I do.
but there's a prayer in here from Teilhard about patient trust. And it's really based upon his sense of how we evolve in terms of life. In this part of the prayer, he talks about, and so I think it is with you, your ideas mature gradually, let them grow, let them shape themselves without undue haste. Don't try to force them on as though you could be today what time, that is to say, grace and circumstances acting on your own goodwill will make of you tomorrow. I do see a very strong correlation with Teilhard and Ignatius. I do see a very strong correlation of Ignatius with Francis. Because to me, Pope Francis is all about this evolutionary thought. Again, personal opinion, please. But what Francis I think is coming against is this whole sense of only looking at the body in terms of Christian morality when there's just so much more.
Mhm.
Now that's caused a lot of people to be upset with him, in terms of his stand. But he's talking about the poor, the neglected, the migrant. Again, migrant, refugees. Think of Ignatius, sense of detachment with his own mother. See the connection? This is truly Ignatian. We know, of course, with Francis's own life in terms of his relationship. If I may, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I've read is that at times Francis's relationship with his own mother was strained. That they had to, if you read Austin Ivory's book, he talks about how that Salesian priest actually took Francis out of the home for a while when the mother was sick. There was a good relationship. His mother taught him how to cook and different things, but I think there was that sense when he was no longer going to be a medical doctor, he was going to be a priest. He was going to save souls rather than lives. I think there was that sense there. So I think that, again, my projection, my opinion. So I think this is where Francis comes up with this tremendous sense of hope, because that was Ignatius. Ignatius feared nothing. Remember, he was a courtier. He believed in these dashing, chivalrous things. And I think he obviously imbued that into the early formation of the Jesuits. And of course, as we were joking about before, the Jesuits are known, that common joke, that when the Jesuit gets to heaven, he says to God, I believe that's my seat. Just that tremendous sense of who an individual is, because it's said that the Jesuits are a bunch of violinists who are all first violins. That there are no second violinists in the Jesuits. They all believe they have a very powerful self-image and who they are. And that's why they go up these different things. But again, I think this book gives a sense as to obviously who Ignatius is. And I think when you understand Ignatius, you understand Francis so much better, that Francis, is not afraid of criticism. He's not afraid of people disagreeing with him. He's not afraid to do something unusual. I mean, I remember that time that he brought that famous abortionist in Italy, and he sat down and had lunch with her, because he just feels as though that, again, this is, that sense of reaching out to the it's fratelli tutti. It's a Samaritan. This is Francis. This is Ignatius, and this is what Father Meissner talks about in terms of this book. I know I've gone over my time. I apologize, but I would share with you that next time I will talk about, if I may, again, the mysticism here of Ignatius, how this ties in, because that's the one thing about Ignatius that just utterly mystifies me in the mysticism. But that whole sense of where Ignatius takes this personal relationship forward. So just in review, this may appeal to you, it may not. You may be into psychoanalysis, you may not be. You may be into psychology. I would just share with you that if you just be open to hearing what I have to say, feel free to talk to me about it, whether it's now or at some other time. And you may say that you don't agree with anything. It doesn't affect your eternal salvation. You're still, it's not where it is. I just find it gets into the depth of humanity. It gets into what we define as what is human. Teilhard talks about that, obviously, in terms of a paleontological perspective. But I think he breaches that in terms of what is humanity. That may not be how you think all the time when you wake up in the morning. That may be how you see life. I just find it utterly fascinating, and I just eat this stuff up because this just really, because this is what I do. Judy, you know this, in terms of you got to find out how a child learns and get to that. And so, like, I'm constantly digging to find this out. So, like, this to me is just like, wow, this is great. I mean, I'm looking forward to, as I said, reading the spiritual exercises book. And then I have to tell you, I consult this book all the time because I remember it and go back. In fact, I had other things here I'm not going to do tonight. I'll do next time. But I think it gives you a sense in terms of, and if I may, how blessed we are to have had the insight of the exercises. I just, like, when people talk to me and they criticize the Holy Father, obviously I'm very respectful of them, but they don't get it. And again, I don't wish to be this in a prideful way, so please don't take it this way. But I truly count myself as being a blessed human being to have done the exercises, because the world just looks differently. And I see things very differently. And then when you read the great thoughts of Ignatius, and again, I'm prone to Teilhard and to Pope Francis, that you can see their insights here. That and again, look at Teilhard. Teilhard died alone. The Jesuits abandoned him because of his thinking, because of the church. That's why he went to China. They decided to get him out of Europe because he was causing all this scandal in terms of his thoughts. This is so, Judy, your comment before, why don't you do something Catholic? This is so common among the Jesuits in terms of taking us to that outer edge of thought. And again, Francis, in terms of his thoughts about the refugees, the migrants, climate. Look at that. I mean, to me, he was prophetic. Look at all this. He was way out ahead of the game in terms of being a world leader in regard to climate change. That's Francis. That's Ignatius.
I think one of the things we forget about Francis is he's a scientist.
Yeah, he was chemistry.
And so much of what he says, I think we often forget that his degrees are actually in science. I think he has a master's degree in chemistry.
Yeah.
Right.
The man is a scientist, which is, just changes a lot of the thinking and where it brings in a lot of the stuff that he talks about. He's a brilliant man.
Oh, but the same token, he's brilliant in the human mind. Okay, so I mean, he's a tremendously gifted man. Tremendously gifted. I mean, God just showered him, obviously, but he's a pope. I get that. He needs to be gifted in that way. But I mean, I just hope that, which is my final statement here, I hope that when people look at Francis, they understand the depth of his giftedness. And I think that Father Meissner in this book, The Psychology of a Saint, talks about the giftedness of Ignatius.
Mhm.
Now that may appeal to some people, it may not. But I really would encourage anybody who is interested in the life of Ignatius to pick the book up. It's not the kind of book you read page by page by page. You may have to read a page and say, I got to think about this one for a bit, and then
Mhm.
come back to it. So I don't think it's the kind of book where, again, I don't know how you read a book, but you can't start at page one and think, oh, I'm going to go all the way through the end before I pick up the next book. I think you'll lose the sense of what this book is. It's almost like a textbook, but I, again, just find it utterly fascinating. So I'm sorry for going over my time here, Anne Marie.
No
Please
problem.
apologize to me. And so I thank you for your patience,
Hey, thank
your
you.
understanding. No one threw any food at me, which is very nice. And I look forward
Advantage
to
of Zoom. I'm going to stop recording.